The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Good afternoon and welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Reality Radio 101. Send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad that we are all here together again today. Thank you for joining us, being part of the conversation. And remember, if you have something to share about the topic that we are addressing today, please do send in an email at instudio101@gmail.com. We would love to read your thoughts, your questions, and what it is that you want to address in terms of this topic. And today's topic is actually one that I find really quite compelling. It's the hidden truth of men's emotional pain and the red pill. So there's a lot that goes into that statement, and I want you to understand that I don't want to give it a simple explanation and pretend that we have the whole thing figured out, because we do not. This is a conversation, and in many things psychological, we can get very wrapped up in a lot of the confusion and complication. And when something does feel confusing and complicated, I like to take the perspective of an observer. Let's gather information. Let's try to understand what these things are. Let's think through what might be going on. Why does it sound so complicated? And for me, when I think about the emotional pain that men live through every day, I actually really don't take that lightly, because a large percentage of the clients that I work with are men. And when I listen to their stories and get a better sense of, what has been going on in their lives, it gives me a broader sense of the kinds of work they do, the things they are exposed to. And remember, there are some statistics that suggest that life can be very dangerous for men. They're more likely to experience violent assault, 93% more likely to die on the job than a woman. They account for 73% of successful suicides. They're given longer prison terms for same or similar crimes than women. And can you imagine 1 in 6 are sexually assaulted? So something's going on that we're really not paying attention to these things. And no, it's not okay just to simply say, what about female rights? Because what we're talking about right now is what's going on with our beloved fathers, brothers, siblings, spouses, and friends who are struggling. And I want to know about that. So today we have Toronto psychologist, Dr. Yaakov Levko, who brings a deep understanding of these issues. And his clinical practice helps inform his understanding, because he also works with men in his practice and needs to contend with these issues. So we're going to get the help of Dr. Levko to understand and navigate a lot of the concepts like the men's rights movement, the red pill, the game, the inner game theorists. There's pickup artists and MGTOWs, men go their own way. There's the incels, the involuntary celibates. Now, there's a ton of controversy, because we also know that along with some of these groups, there have been people who are tied to it who acted in very violent ways in our community, like Alec Minassian, a 25-year-old who drove a rented van down Yonge Street in North York, Ontario, killing 10 people and injuring 16 in a deadly vehicular attack on April the 23rd, 2018. So we know that there's something going on that we can't ignore as well, which is the violent piece of it. So all of that said, I want to thank Dr. Levko for joining us and give you a chance to help us understand some of these issues. So let me just start by thanking you and introducing you, Dr. Levko, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Anna. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Why don't we just start with understanding these concepts, like just the men's rights movement, men's rights activists, MRAs, as they're called. What's your understanding of the MRA movement, and why did it even come to be? Most people think, well, men's rights, well, men have all the rights, so why does there need to be an MRA?
Well, my understanding is the men's rights activist movement grows out of feminist allies, men who were feminist allies in the 70s and 80s, and over the course they wanted to support women in their liberation movement. And then over time, as the conversation sort of expanded to what type of changes they wanted to see in society, so then there was the kind of an evolution of thinking, and at times a divergence of understanding between the different, what became factions, unfortunately. So, and I want to say just one thing off the top is that I don't consider myself to be an expert per se on sort of the sociology of these things. And I just, what I see is mainly from the perspective of my clinical practice and what I see happening around me in society. It's not that I've gone to do any particular research in this area. The things that I talk about are, I think, considered more or less general knowledge for someone who's paying attention, someone who's sort of living within the culture and trying to account for these things in the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the men's rights movement, activist movement, actually started with men who were supporting the feminist movement. But, that's an interesting thing, because a lot of women who consider themselves feminists actually look at MRAs as kind of the enemy. And, we'll spend a little bit of time talking a bit about the documentary filmmaker, Cassie Jaye, who actually described herself as a proud feminist, deciding to so-called meet the enemy by going into the underbelly, or what she described as the dark underbelly of the men's rights movement. And this, she was talking about her view of things before she actually produced her film, The Red Pill, which is really a movie that looks at how men are really struggling as a result of the kind of work they do, the violence they're exposed to, inequalities in certain aspects of the justice system. So it's interesting to me that you say that MRA started with men who were supporting feminists? Why do you think there was that split, that feminists then have a difficult time like recognizing that, it's okay for you as a feminist to have rights. It's also okay for men who are struggling to be recognized for those struggles as well.
Well, again, I don't consider myself an expert in the sort of how these things have unfolded historically. I think the movie that you mentioned, The Red Pill, covers the ground quite well. But I think that there has been a quite vociferous resistance to hearing what these men are saying. And, there seems to be there are feminists who believe that for some reason, hearing these voices, these statistics, the research, things like the treatment of men at times in family court system, alienation, things we mentioned at the top of the show, suicide rates. There's obviously a lot of distress, a lot of male distress going on, and I think that there's a difficulty for some people who are identifying themselves as feminists. I think by no means all, but there is a resistance to sort of just opening the space to hear about that before getting into interpretations about exactly why that is, or whether, because some would like to interpret and say that, well, that's an aspect of the patriarchy and that all that level of analysis, but really just sort of listening to the experiences that people have and trying to understand them. And of course, when you work in the field that I'm in psychology, clinical and counseling psychology, you're going with the individual stories. The people come into you one at a time, or sometimes in a couple, or what have you, and you sort of track what the person has experienced in their life and what they're struggling with, and these topics on a sort of societal scale come in because it's something that the client is talking about as impacting them. And so that, to me, that's the perspective that I'm concerned with primarily. And in doing that, I do need a sense of what have been the historical changes and how they seem to be impacting on the people who come into my office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I like the fact that you recognize, first of all, this is a individual issue, collectively, it's also an issue. When you look at the suicide rates, the successful suicide rates, the violence that men experience, and the number of tragic injuries and deaths that men experience in the workplace, you start to realize that there's something really important that we're not paying attention to. And I had mentioned this before. I have a large male population in my clinic. Probably largely because I work with so many veterans, military, paramilitary, police, paramedics, firefighters, and a lot of injured workers who come to my clinic because we specialize in trauma, have been exposed to trauma at their workplace. This is not to say that I don't work with women who are also similarly affected or work in, potentially dangerous roles, because I do that as well. But the reality is there are more men in my practice who have been injured on the job than women in my practice who have been injured on the job. And you're right. When we see this on a very individual level, it really makes the direct injury very clear. We can't just pretend that these things are not happening, and yet there's this bias where there's a desire to not hear this truth, to not know that this is really happening. And that's very psychological, right? What is it that makes this so much of an unappealing truth. People don't want to hear it. People don't want to see the truth about it. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the gains that women have made in terms of access to spaces and activities and professions in society have been hard won. And I feel that, and again, I'm not presenting this as an expert opinion, but my sense of it is that there's a sense of vulnerability, that there's kind of looming sense of the power of what previously was this kind of patriarchal suppression of women's dreams and desires to be on an equal footing with men in society. The suffragettes were starting with just the basic right to vote for their own political representatives, and then moving on in the second wave more into other aspects of career and sort of questioning the division of labor within families and so on and so forth. So we've been through generations now of these changes and evolution in society, and they've become quite well established also in terms of law and in terms of our popular media and the cultural life. Nonetheless, it seems that beginning to look at, okay, so how we've had these many changes now, what are some of the impacts of these changes? Like any large scale change in society is going to have positive effects, and it's going to have, for some people, will have negative effects. That's just a fact of life. There's no major social movement or change that has no impacts that are not adverse for someone or another. And so I think that what I see a fair bit are young men in particular who are feeling what they consider to be adverse effects of some of the changes that have come about in the wake of feminism. Feminism is a hugely broad term. One of these terms that is so broad that it may actually be, it's a disservice even to group the different ideologies and movements under one rubric. But I think that in starting to look at the experiences of these men and understand where they're coming from and how their perspective has been shaped coming up within systems, within educational system, within the cultural context, which is essentially post-feminist, and how they feel that has been impacting on them. There's a tremendous reluctance to hear those voices, I think, because of the implication that it somehow threatens to roll back the clock on the gains that women have made. And I'm sympathetic to that concern. At the same time, my sense of it is that the changes that have happened in our society are not going back. And I don't think that's what the groups of people in the online discourse we refer to as the manosphere or the red pill, that's not what they're advocating for either, at least in terms of what I've seen.
Unless it's like a really radicalized group, because I know that there is some of that content out there as well. And I think this is part of what makes the conversation so difficult, is that there are examples of really quite concerning, very radicalized positions on these online platforms as well that are frightening.
Yes, I agree. I think that certainly is the case. And of course, we've had the incidents of essentially terroristic violence that have occurred, mm-hmm. which are extremely disturbing. I will say that, I think that, the way that we got in touch with each other was part of a conversation within the profession of psychology about this manosphere and these different factions within it. And my attempt to communicate to my colleagues and to say, okay, well, there's some discernment to be made here. There's a lot of anger, of course, and I think it's not dissimilar from the type of rage and anger and maybe violent fantasizing even that someone would find on very radical feminist sites, for example. So you'll find, if you go into comment sections on websites that deal with this type of men's issues, you'll find some very angry people who are venting their spleen online, and we're all very familiar with how that goes. But you're going to find the same thing on radical feminist websites as well. A lot of anger and frustration. People having their personal lives, and they, put that out onto a political debate or cultural debate.
Well, this is where we get into the reality that, if we're going to have a driver in our life, might as well look to using that power for good and not evil, and to kind of like stay heart-based, because, we're kind of all the same, and we're not really here to destroy each other, but rather to learn to be with each other. Destroying each other is really not going to take us to any kind of evolution as human beings. I just want to clarify for people in terms of the red pill. I want to make sure that people know what this is really all about. So in 1999, there was a film, very, very famous film called The Matrix, and Lawrence Fishburne, who offers Keanu Reeves this choice in the film to take the blue pill, where, it's like, you just continue living life as you always have, or you take the red pill and you go down this deep rabbit's hole. And in the rabbit's hole, you start to go, okay, this is the reality. And the idea is that, with the red pill, you're going to have an opportunity to, in this case with the manosphere, to kind of contribute and be part of a network of websites and chat rooms where men are talking about a variety of things, some of them very kind of meaningful conversations, like, what does it mean that I could not see my children for the last 10 years, that a judge made a decision and now I can't see my children, and the absurdly unfair kind of outcome of that, because there are men who very much should have access to their children, and from a legal context, it has not gone well. That's not always the way it goes. Sometimes you've got women who are also engaged in unfortunate parental alienation issues. But going back to the manosphere, the issue with the manosphere, I think the thing that really frightens people is that the network of websites and blog rooms and chat rooms and things like that, where people are discussing men's rights, they're also potentially sharing very hateful opinions, or just using all of their focus and attention to figure out how to attract the attention of a woman or pick up a woman. And I'm gonna read one of these very unfortunate comments, because it's part of the reason that this whole area gets such bad press, and we have to kind of recognize that it's the entire platform and how it comes together that then creates this unfortunate kind of closing off, an unwillingness to really hear. So this is one. It's from this fellow. His name is Roosh V. And Roosh V had an idea that it should be legal to rape a woman on private property. And later, Roosh V claimed that this was just a joke, parody, that it's not real. This was actually a Toronto-based commentator who wanted to organize a meetup group. And then what happened was the meetup was canceled because I don't know if you know this, a bunch of female boxers threatened to disrupt the event with violence. Did you hear about that?
I don't. Roosh V is sort of like an infamous figure with a variety of really truly odious views. And I don't recall. He's not one of the people that I really pay much attention to. But I think to me it's an unfortunate example to bring someone like that who expressed himself in the way that he does. And I think it's also important when you're talking about I think some definitions are important here. When you talk about the red pill, so I think, and I'm not sure if I'm be taking us a little bit aside here, but if that's okay.
Oh yeah, that's great. Because actually, I think definitions are needed, and I am not an expert in this field. So if I've misspoke, please do correct me.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to just sort of get a core understanding of what are the contentions here. What are the shared? Because we say the manosphere, it's people that are moving in opposite directions. You know, the men's rights faction is wanting to change society and make certain reforms in society that they consider to be more fair or essentially more equal between men and women in society. Then there's the MGTOW, men go their own way, who are essentially moving in the opposite direction. And they are wanting to disengage from society, disengage from women, disengage from relationships, and sort of find a way to live in the world while not engaging with general society, which they consider to be adverse for them in their interests, as men in today's society. Then there's the pickup artists, and their concern is, applying this kind of behavioral technology to overcome the loneliness and the separateness that we find in our society, to be able to satisfy their sexual cravings, and while at the same time being cautious about entering into sort of committed relationships with women. There's a variety of factions. Also the incels as well, which are considered sort of like a sub-faction of the MGTOW. I think I would be correct if I would. My understanding of this sort of literature, this discourse, is that the unifying idea is something called the gynocracy, and that idea is, many people interpret the red pill as advocating a kind of return to patriarchy or turn to traditionalism. And I think for many people, it would be surprising to learn that the red pill is actually the opposite of that, because they consider to be the sort of traditional rules between men and women to be against men, in the sense of, when there's a war, it's the men that go off to war. That type of argument. If there's a ship is sinking, so it's the women and children first, and the men go down with the ship. That there's and there's been a lot written about this, and I think it's something which is up for debate. It's not something what I'm taking a position on in this conversation, but I think that there's a certain feminist narrative around history, and then there's a competing narrative around history, and we do see some prominent examples, such as the ones I just cited, in which men, especially young men of military age, historically and across different civilizations over time, have to be seen as disposable. And it's the women that need to be protected at all costs. And of course, there's very straightforward evolutionary reasons for that. It's an adaptive thing for our species to protect the women who may already be pregnant and they're fertile. If you lose the women, then you lose the ability for the future. So if there's someone who needs to go out and protect the village or the troop of primates and so on, it's going to be the males, who apparently, if we listen to evolutionary, the evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology, have actually evolved to have the upper body strength and the testosterone and so forth to go out and aggressively defend, at risk of life and limb, the women and children who are sort of back in the village or back behind the wall. And I think that what we're seeing today with this red pill is a kind of a perspective which takes in the arc of human history and says, you know what, we don't want to do that anymore. So just like the women are saying, we don't want to do our role in the traditional, the sort of traditionalist societies, and the women are going to be with the children and in the home and around the home fires, while the men get to go out and do things in the world and compete in economic life of society and so forth. So the men are also saying, we don't want that deal either. That wasn't working for us either. That's also what the red pill community will say. That's also the gynocracy. and because it places the priority on the lives of women and not on the betterment of men. The men are bound by duty and honor and these all these classical values in order to, which gives them a kind of, you get a medal, you go out and you lose your leg or your life in the war, and they give you a pin, you can put on some symbolic where your sacrifice is honored. And so these men are saying, no, we want to check out of that. And at the same time, they're also saying that the new order under feminism we've had for the last couple of generations now, where we have affirmative action, where women there's been a strong movement within education systems, both elementary and post-secondary, to ensure that women have a voice and have a place, that they're encouraged, that the boys are not dominating conversation in the school. As we know, the vast majority of elementary teachers are women. The young boys are having trouble identifying and finding a way to, there's a lot of issues at once, but essentially they're saying we don't like the traditionalism, and they're saying they also don't like the new deal under feminism, which they see as favoring women. We now have more women graduating from university. We've got a lot of alienated young men. And so I think that whatever the people consider to be the merits of this perspective on history and its attitude towards both traditionalism and a more sort of contemporary post-feminist way of seeing in society, that these men are alienated from both of those. They are not advocating a return to traditionalism. It's often unclear exactly how they would like to see the future. Some of them are extremely pessimistic. The MRAs, the men's rights activists, they will see themselves essentially as trying to complete the work of feminism and protect it from what they will interpret as an overshooting of the mark. And that when it came to equality, that was what they were advocating, and they themselves were part of the feminist movement. But then it went from equality, in their opinion. Again, I'm trying to be careful here, so I'm not
I can hear how hard you're working to keep in the middle line so that you don't alienate people as you're speaking. But it is actually kind of fascinating, because you're raising all these issues that most people who think about this topic don't really understand it. So I mean, for me, listening, it adds to the conversation. It helps to frame what we're really contending with, which is actually very complex. So to be clear about it, it sounds like those actual early advocates, like I'm going to now reference Dr. Warren Farrell, who's the author of The Myth of the Male Power. And he discusses this concept that you raised, that from history, lots of examples. Men were considered disposable because they were the ones with power. They were physically, I'm talking about, they had more power. They were not going to get pregnant. They weren't going to have to tend to young children. They were the ones who were going to have to go out and actually do these really hard jobs, fight battles, go into difficult situations to gather food, whatever it is. And that it's almost like, as I'm hearing you talk, it's like we have to kind of write a new guidebook, to not just for the men who are struggling with this, but for women as well, to remain open and willing to hear about this issue with an open and willing mind. Now, it's interesting that you've had to be very careful in how you're speaking right now, because the filmmaker of The Red Pill, Cassie Jaye, she spoke a lot after the fact in her TED Talk. She spoke a lot about how she became, along with her film, very vilified. People were protesting when the film would go to screening at different theaters, when we were going to theater to watch films, in 2016, that, people would protest, and some of those people had not even watched the film. So, what they were actually protesting was, it was a little strange. I did not watch the entire film. I watched parts of it, and I found it actually very, very compelling. There were some men who were describing, really unfortunate things that they've had to deal with in their life, and what it was doing to them. And it was not difficult to have compassion for those men. The part that I find interesting is how rigid we have to remain to not hear these stories. So I want to shift a little and make sure that we can get through some of the emails that are coming through. So let's take a little bit of time and do that. And I'm just going to read through them, and we'll address them one after the other, if that's okay with you.
Yes, of course.
Perfect. Okay. So this one is from Bonnie. She just says, "Hi, a great topic today. So many men, in quotations, play the role of being, quotations, macho in life's adversities, but deep down they are suffering and scared. Thanks for the topic." Well, so that's just really beautiful, because all of a sudden we kind of just recognize, it's like, of course they're going to be suffering and scared. You see that in your clinical practice. I certainly see it in my clinical practice. It's not unusual. So if you're looking at somebody and thinking, oh, this macho front is the whole thing, think again. What are your thoughts about that?
Which aspect specifically?
Just this idea of playing macho, and if you think that that's the whole picture, you have to think again. You have to look a little bit more closely.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's sort of the classic masculine virtues, courage, sort of physical courage, throwing oneself in the breach, the isolation of affect. And that's one that you and I will be familiar with, because I've also worked with military and police veterans and people who've had traumatic experiences, and helping them to sort that through. And so this ability in the moment, let's say, of combat, to isolate affect. And so it's not that they're not having an emotion. The emotion is there. It just gets put aside in order to continue towards the goal, complete the mission, save the person who's been hurt. So people, these virtues are virtues for a reason. Those virtues will also need to be present in any woman who, for example, wants to go into combat or into a highly competitive corporate environment, or I've worked with lawyers, female lawyers, with 80-hour weeks and highly contentious litigation and so forth. It's sort of setting oneself aside, one's emotions in the moment. Let's say if you're on the field of battle in Afghanistan and your friend's just been blown up beside you, you need to isolate those feelings in order to function and kind of move forwards towards the goal, stay alive, the rest of it. Or if you're going down into a coal mine, for example, generations of men who went into these places and risking their lives on a day in, day out for an entire lifetime. And many of them died, and many of them, experienced fear, but it's like, this ability to isolate affect. And it is a kind of an ability, and I think it is a learned ability. And
yeah, the biggest issue here, I don't know if you've read My Grandmother's Hands by Reesma Menakin, but it's an excellent book and talks a lot about how people, in this case, Resma's actually speaking about racialized trauma and the kind of what happens in our bodies as a result of it. But he talks a lot about how trauma gets stored in the body and the need to address that. And, in the population that we're discussing, I mean, where does healing really need to come from? The same thing. It's still going to be on this very individual level where we learn how to attend to our own pain and suffering, where we learn to leave space for that. And a lot of the fields that, we were just discussing now, paramilitary, military, a lot of people are taught to shut all of that down in order to just do the job. But then you end up getting people who are so horribly traumatized that they can no longer cope well in society, and they don't necessarily have the daily skills for discharging that trauma that lives so deeply in their body. I'm going to move on to the next comment. This one is from Claudette, who says, I am a big fan of Dr. Levko. Well, there you go, Dr. Levko.
Nice to hear.
What's that?
Yeah, hopefully that'll stay the vein of sentiment here. We'll have
well, you're just doing an amazing job with this, because it first of all, you're very well versed on this topic, and probably more so than most people. So I'm really appreciating the conversation. So Claudette says, I'm a big fan of Dr. Levko. His work is exceptional on this topic. I am pro women's and children's rights. However, in today's society, everything is focused on women and children, which is very important, but men are forgotten, especially white Christian and Jewish men. Any comments?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's of a piece with what we've been discussing, that we have to appreciate the acculturation, how deep it goes, this acculturation of boys and men to set themselves aside and to have these sort of classical virtues. And I think for me, we have to have compassion for everyone in understanding that our society is going through an unbelievably profound shift. It's a multidimensional change, an epochal shift that we're going through. And this aspect we're talking about today is simply one aspect of it. But the deindustrialization, the information age, the merging with the technology, there's so many things happening. I mean, the classical virtues that we've described, which I think come from a prehistorical, it's actually built into our genes. It helps to form the way our physical bodies are. That as men and women, that we have these differences, and so we're in a kind of an awkward in between. And I think that we need to appreciate that we're in an awkward in between. And so that what the men, and particularly the young men, are experiencing, for example, is that on the one hand, they're told to be vulnerable. They're told to be in touch with their emotions. Their female teachers, their mothers, who are often the single parent, are encouraging them to show and share their emotions and their vulnerability. But then in another moment, they are doing that and being stigmatized for it as not masculine enough, let's say in their dating lives. So that men who are not having the sort of classical male bonding, masculine identity formation that would normally in the past have happened, they're now finding it difficult to find a mate, and so they're feeling there's a double message here that they've gotten from society. On the one hand, these classical male virtues are somehow not good or even toxic, and then on the other hand, they find that they actually remain, they persist. And that so they have not necessarily developed these virtues in the same way that previous generations of men have, for various reasons, which we can go into. But at the same time, they're still being held to this standard, and it's leaving them very confused. Right. And I think that confusion is something that's really been my focus in trying to how do I help these young men to navigate in this current cultural environment, which is complex and shifting and in the middle of profound changes. And maybe in 50 years or 100 years, it'll be something more stable again that can be sort of, you get acculturated to it and you know what the rules are. Right now, the rules are very, very confusing, and there's a lot of people suffering. Men, women, children, everybody.
I absolutely agree. That's part of the reason that I thought it would be so great for us to have this conversation. It's interesting because you and we went back and forth a couple of times before you agreed to speak with me, and certainly before you agreed to go live on air with me, because I think it's true that you don't know, and you wouldn't know what you're going to encounter, and how hot the topic could get depending on who you are speaking with. But you raised something that was very important in our back and forth dialogue, and that was that this whole issue, the red pill, the manosphere, the men's rights activist movement is not you. These are your words. Okay, so I'm just going to read this back to you because I really found this very useful. This is not some obscure cult. This is a broad cultural ideological movement which is impacting the general culture in a manner analogous to the feminist movement in its early days, and its influence has grown largely out of the public mind because of harsh stigmatization and ignoring by the media. And see, I'm just really glad that you kind of captured it in such a clear way, because I think it needed to be said. I'm going to move on to the next email because we now have about 15 minutes left and a whole pile of emails to go through, and I want to try to go through as many of them as we can, much appreciating your thoughts about each one. This one I find interesting. So this one is from Gail, and Gail says, for some reason, men seem to take more chances in the workplace, explaining more injuries or even more fatalities. And it is this reason, a lot of times, why these tragedies happen. Men just seem to circumvent safety protocols in the work environment more often than women. Well, okay. All right. So, Dr. Levko, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, sure. There's a certain swagger that men can have, and I think but I mean, again, it's a huge generalization. But I mean, I don't think it's really, the people who, let's say, go up at 4 a.m. and minus 30 here, and chip the ice off of the electricity lines and this kind of thing, the usually are men, right? And this, we have something in excess of 90% of workplace accidents are men. It doesn't necessarily reflect that, all or most men are reckless by nature. I think there's, obviously we know that there is that aspect in play at times, but it's just that the men are doing the work, the sanitation workers, miners, combat, it's these dangerous fields. It tends to be men. And these days also there are women who are coming in and doing these things as well. And I'm sure as that trend continues, that their unfortunate incidents of workplace accidents will also increase.
Well, and I have women in my practice who have gone into fields where they're exposed to these things and later were injured in some way. And yes. I would absolutely agree that, sure, I mean, some people can be reckless. Okay, that's true. But the reality is even if you're doing your best, we all have accidents when we're engaged in work that could be potentially dangerous. And thank goodness for those brave people who are doing this work, who are willing to get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and do all that stuff and get our power grid back online. And, what would we do? What would we do without these brave people who are doing this work? Okay, yeah. Here's another one. Jake, this is from Jake. And Jake says, does your guest have a web presence? And of course, actually, Dr. Labko does. I will just say, that if you go to traumapractice.org and you hover over resources and into the blog and radio show, you will see the upcoming podcast of this, which you can listen to again, but it also has the direct link for Dr. Levko's website, and that is www.yaacovlefcoe.com. So it's right there. I know with reading websites online, it's a little bit tricky. So if you just go to the link to our blog page, then you'll find his web presence there, which we have added. Anything that you want to add in terms of your web presence? Because I know you've just updated your blog or your website.
Yes, it's yakovlefko.com. Lefko is F like Frank. So YAACOVLEF like Frank, COE.com. Psychologist, clinical and counseling, based in Toronto. And happy for any inquiries. I wanted to go back to the previous point just for a moment to say that I think when we're talking about like workplace accidents, we need to include in this sort of masculine virtue of reaching the goal no matter what, that putting the work ahead of one's own well-being. And this will be evident also in women who get involved in previously male fields. So for example, someone who's working in an executive suite, usually those people are putting in a huge amount of hours a week, and their personal lives will suffer. And often their emotional lives can be tremendously suffering. And you and I see that in our work. And people who are very, very high functioning people, it's not just a question of, physical accidents. It's also just stress and stress related illness. This competitive, always super hyper goal directed way of being, which is what characterizes many of these fields, sort of the economic life of society as men have constructed it, is quite hazardous for people, and also for the women that engage with it. But I think women seem to be more reluctant to sort of put themselves aside in that way, and they want more work-life balance. They want a more, so I think it'll be a good development for society if we can attenuate a bit some of this hyper-competitive style. Go ahead, yeah.
A long time ago, when I was I think I was about 18 at the time, I took a job as a signal person. Those people who are out there in the cold and the heat and whatever, and there's a construction site on a highway, and you've got this sign and you turn it and the cars go through when they've got, the go ahead, and, it's a, red sign to stop when, and, you're just holding it and standing there and holding it and standing there. And oh my God, I think they hired me because they were told that they had to hire, a certain percentage of women if they could find them for the crews. And, I thought, well, the pay was great. Oh my God, the job was so grueling. I honestly did not last for 2 weeks. I'm embarrassed to say I'm pretty diligent with most everything that I do, but I didn't have the capacity to do this thing, which actually kind of upset me, but it gave me some appreciation of what it actually takes to stand out there. Because sometimes you'll look and you'll see these signal people and you'll think, well, they're just standing around, but it's like, believe me, they're not just standing around. And unless you're doing it, put aside your judgments. Okay, let's move on from that little piece of information. This is from Josh, and Josh says, good afternoon. Just a humorous side note here. Thank you, Josh. We need the humorous side note, as you just saw. Dr. Levko's voice sounds exactly like actor Rob Morrow. Love it. Did you hear that? Are you familiar with who this is? Morrow?
I would have to look it up, but I'll assume that's a compliment.
I think it's a compliment.
I have a positive attitude.
Exactly. And Morrow was actually the actor on Northern Exposure. He played Dr. Joel Fleischman, and he won 3 Golden Globes and 2 Emmys. So there you go. So apparently you have a great voice. And if you had gone into a different field, you may be a Emmy award-winning actor right now. Okay, so then this is the last one that we have, actually, unless more come in, which happens actually close to the end of the show. This one is from Ken, and Ken says, I am so happy that you were talking about this topic. I am too, Ken. I think this is super interesting. I'm so glad that you joined us today, Dr. Levko. It's just fantastic. Nothing against women, Ken says. Isn't it unfortunate that Ken has to say nothing against women? It's like it's not a competition. This is a real issue. It stands on its own, right? And that's what you've been trying to explain. However, men always seem to get the last one on the list for mental health, rights, and solace. Men have very emotional situations in their life as well, yet sometimes they do not show it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's true. I think that's the acculturation, but it's true and it's not true now, because we've been in about a 40-year process of institutionally encouraging, sort of trying to countermand that classical acculturation and get the boys to be more emotionally present. And I think that's, on the one hand, a very positive development. And on the other hand, it's leaving them somewhat confused, because they do get this negative feedback for that, right? And so this is, I think, if there's several sort of core insights I think that people can take away today, and that would be one of them. To understand, when people ask, like, why are these 20-something men hiding out in the basement with the pornography and the video games and sort of just the cannabis and checking out of everything? Not that I'm against cannabis, not that I'm against any of those things, but just sort of checking out of society, not moving into relationships, not moving on with things, not completing their post-secondary training in many cases, dropping out. I think this is a really big part of it. This mixed message about sort of how are you supposed to be? Are you supposed to be more like women in the sense of being able to, and again, it's a generalization, but more able to be in touch with one's emotions, express those emotions fluidly, and not expect negative feedback for that, but quite the opposite, to potentially expect people to come in and to be reassuring and helpful and create a place for those emotions? Or are you going to expect getting cut down and told, sort of pull yourself up and pull yourself together here? And that, I think that's a really big issue. That this aspect is of its own, if we could find some way to address it, would be a huge help to the confused cohort of young men that we have coming up now.
Yeah, it's and that I really have a lot of sympathy for that. Just this idea that you've got these young men who are really stuck with these conflicting motivations, and they become frozen and unable to move forward. And you said hiding in their basement with porn and cannabis, checking out. I mean, that's the last place that we need these young men. We need them to be part of society and to be embraced by the larger human community. I mean, we're all in this together. So we have to find a way to do this in a way that's meaningful. One more thing that I'm just going to add. I am married to a very sweet-natured guy. He's supportive, and he's actually a nurse. So this idea that men have learned to be more emotionally present, and that would be true for my husband because of the kind of person he is, but also then he's gone into a field where this is actually something that is accepted and embraced. But I can see that kind of tenderheartedness can be used against men. But I mean, from my perspective, it just seems to lead to the best kinds of relationships. So there's this like real strange thing, because on one hand, you're saying these men who have learned how to be more emotionally present are finding that they're not adapting well to their role in our society, but also maybe in not being able to establish themselves in relationships as well.
I think especially in dating life. I think it's the dating life of young men, which is such a critical thing, to sort of not be isolated, not be contact, comfort, having connection, human connection and intimacy. That's where it's the most painful to discover that the way you've been raised to be and encouraged by your mother, by your teachers, by the system itself, it has left you in a situation where many of the young women that you'll be encountering will say, well, hold on, aren't you, you're sort of a nice guy, but not someone that I would find interesting or attractive for dating. And so that's where we get the red pill. We get the pickup artist faction of the red pill comes in and very directly, purporting to address that, training men not to show their emotion, to hold back, to, there's a certain behavioral technology there. And the fact is, empirically speaking, it's effective. It is effective. And we have that in the psychological literature. It comes out of evolutionary psychology, human mating practice, and so forth. So we need to contend with the actual issues here, understand what the conflict what the scenario is for these young men, in order to even to be really to speak intelligently about it, and to relate to our clients, when they come in. And that was my initial effort within the profession of psychology, just to be able to have the basic terms and the basic understanding of the different factions and groups within the manosphere, to understand this is not a marginal thing. This is here to stay, because there are certain core concerns here. It become inescapable for young men to contend with this in some form or another, and therefore this set of ideas will be relevant. Let's get them out in the open and discuss them, and bring them into dialogue with other contentions, feminist ideas, and let's have it out. Let's have our society be the best that it can be, not by ignoring or stigmatizing, but by actually engaging with the different voices.
Beautiful. And that is a perfect place for us to end this conversation. It has been profoundly helpful and interesting. I very much appreciate you joining with me. This is Dr. Dr. Levko, and he has a practice in Toronto. And if you're interested in his work, go to the blog, pick up his link to his website. He's a psychologist in Toronto. And thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us again today, and for your incredible work, Dr. Levko.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Have a great day, and goodbye to everybody. See you next month.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.